tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
And let me just take a moment on this to talk about the importance of free speech. Now, this has always been for me the absolute hill to die on for me, because my belief is that without freedom of speech, we do not have any other freedoms. We can't argue for the things about which we care if we don't have freedom of speech. So when I see protesters, however many there are, coming out and speaking up for parental rights, and I see counter protesters, even if I disagree with them, I look at that exchange and I say, this is a profound win for society, that these two groups can meet in the middle and, despite the tensions, express their position on what is a very real and very important issue in society. Now, the difference is that the parental rights folks are not trying to shut anyone down. The counter-protesters are. The counter-protesters actually do not believe that the protesters have a right to be there. They believe that it should all be denounced and dismissed as hate. As an illustration of this, let me share a statement from British Columbia's Human Rights Commissioner. She has issued what she calls a response to the hate-fueled marches planned for today. She says she's very disturbed by news of the hate-fueled marches. She says the human rights of trans and LGBTQ2SAI plus people are not up for debate. Denying the existence of trans and gender diverse people, including calls to erase trans and LGBTQ2SAI plus people from our province's curricula, is hate, and hate should have no place in our community or in our schools. She goes on to talk about hate. Everything is hate. It's hateful. She says it's time to take action against the campaigns of misinformation and organized hate. And it goes on to say that we must stand together against hate. There's no space for hate. Hate. Now, I did not see a great deal of hate going towards the counter demonstrators. I saw a lot of hate coming away from them. But even so, hate is an emotion which people have a right to feel in a free society. It may be undesirable. It may be something we want to counter. But the Human Rights Commissioner of British Columbia would do well to look at what is the most fundamentally important human right in existence. The human right to freedom of speech is the foundation of a free and democratic society. And for a so-called human rights commissioner to spend time denouncing freedom of expression rather than focusing on the importance of preserving and protecting it is absolutely disgraceful. She has a right to weigh in on whatever issues she wants to weigh in on. She's a very well-paid civil servant. I am not immune from the understanding that human rights commissions are not places that generally respect and uphold free speech. But without freedom of expression, you can't do any of these things that you care about and advocate for any of the issues you want to advocate on. Now, all of this is part and parcel of why these exchanges are so very important, and why this is a display that we should be welcoming, even if we disagree with someone on the other side. And I have a lot of respect for anyone that is counter-protesting who believes that both sides have a right to play in this. But when this human rights commissioner says there is no place for debate, or she says it's not up for debate, well, you don't actually get the right to decide what is or is not up for debate. In a free society, we are able to discuss these issues. Now, I tweeted about this earlier, and someone said, oh, you're saying that trans rights are up for debate? I would say that they are in the context of what follows. You cannot unilaterally assert broad trans rights, whatever those are, without weighing those against, let's say, women's rights. The right for women to have a space that is single sex, the right for women to be able to participate in women's only sports. So this is a very easy way of seeing that women's rights and trans rights, unless defined narrowly, will be in conflict with one another. Now, how do we solve that? We solve it by debating it. So to say that this is not up for debate means that your way is the right way and no one else can have a different opinion. And that is the danger of what's being argued here. And I should just say, to segue into an interview I had planned irrespective of this, this is not something that is just existing on the streets of Toronto and Ottawa and Calgary and Vancouver and London and Pickering today. This is an issue that goes at its core to a long-standing academic problem. And by that, I mean a problem in academia. Now, we've seen over many years, Alan Bloom wrote about this 35 years ago in his seminal book, The Closing of the American Mind, that universities have become more hotbeds of indoctrination and ideological intolerance than the halls of inquiry that they once were. We've seen this get worse and worse and worse over time, however, and now one of the big problems is that good people who envision a future in academia want to self select out of this because they do not see a place for their worldview. And that was at the crux of Brock Eldon's story. Now, Brock Eldon teaches at the RMIT University in Vietnam, though he is Canadian. And he's written in C2C Journal about this, Ground Zero in the Culture War. It's a 3-part nonfiction novella chronicling what was at one point a bit of optimism he held about academia to, at the end, a bit of cynicism and perhaps a more jaded outlook. Brock Eldon joins me now from Hanoi. I know it's very late where you are, Brock, so thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Andrew.
Let's start first off with the way you're telling this story, because I think we've seen, and there's merit to them, and I've written a few of them, just the garden variety columns about, this happened on this university, this happened on the others. You've told it as a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the motivation for that was, I guess, just as I was completing the degree back in Canada at Queen's, following 2 years overseas, getting some more context about when we talk about wokeism, talking about Marxism, living in South Korea, within 200 kilometers of the North Korean border, then moving on to Beijing, Vietnam. I suppose I've told it as a story just because it felt like such. It felt like, as I say at one point in the essay, being in a Kafka. It was Kafkaesque from the outset, from the very first class. With that context and with that background, it was like coming back to a completely different place. And the idea came quite late in the degree, but I think the feeling of this being a surreal kind of alternative world to the one that I had known growing up in Canada, that came early on. And I also I wanted to show, as you said, there's a lot of columns about this, but I wanted to show the reader what this actually feels like from the student perspective. And I think that was the main objective. I've written other kinds of nonfiction, but a narrative from the student point of view about this based on my experience.
I mentioned in my crude summation that you went in wide eyed and enthusiastic and you came out with all of these challenges and problems that you've raised here. Was there for you a flash in the pan, a pivotal moment where you realized this is not what I thought it was or hoped it would be? Or would you say it was much more of a slow burn? It was a more gradual process?
I would say it was immediate. With the onset of classes, it was from I arrived about a month early, socialized with people in the program, and there were some minor red flags. There were arguments that came up that I disagreed with, but it wasn't until we got to class and we were asked to introduce ourselves with a, a sharing stick, um, some kind of appropriated indigenous object by a white professor. We were asked to pass around this sharing stick and identify ourselves by our preferred pronouns, and then talk about our background with feminism, and the language of safe spaces came up a lot, and the classroom policies of trigger warnings. All of that within about a 20-minute window was quite. It was like, this is reminding me of a lot of teaching in middle schools in China.
And just on that note, you were punished for not using trigger warnings, right?
Yes, early because it's not in any classroom documents, but it's enforced. At least when I was there, it wasn't in classroom documents, but it was enforced, and I didn't. The first time around, I simply didn't understand that this was expected, demanded of students, that you begin any presentation presenting potentially triggering subject matter with a trigger warning. I wasn't aware, and but I was punished twice for not using trigger warnings. And the difficulty for me was determining what's what's problematic and what's not.
Yeah.
Um, the first time it was in this Indigenous gender studies class where the sharing stick was used. I wasn't especially. I could sense that there were going to be problems there, but I did not expect there to be problems presenting a paper on Othello. Um, I was reprimanded for that in an email, and to this day, I still can't figure out which passage I read that was offending. Um, and for that, I was docked 3%.
Just the one aspect of this that I find kind of interesting is that I do believe there are good places and good pockets and good professors
Hmm.
in university. And I actually had not a terrible time with this. I mean, certainly there was a bit of a cultural clash on campus when I went to university, and I'd even returned for something more recently and was still managed to sidestep any of the landmines. You were picking courses, it sounds like, where you could have seen this from a mile away. Like, Indigenous gender studies. That just seems to me like the epitome of wokeism. Shakespeare and cross-dressing, another one that jumps out here. So
Mm.
I say this respectfully, but what were you expecting with that course selection?
Hmm. That's a question that's come up a fair bit. I think that's fair. The the issue was that those are the only two courses that I had any reservation about from the outset. But the issue was that all of the other courses were so objectively questionable, just in their obvious political bias. Um, the other courses I took were very traditionally titled: Jane Austen and Her Contemporaries, 18th century manuscripts. There weren't a lot of. I did not sign up for Black Lives Matter or Indigenous incarceration, or the refugee crisis or Victorian bodies. I tried to avoid all that, but there are certain requirements, and I figured, at least with the Shakespeare course, we must be talking about something other than cross-dressing in a Shakespeare course. The
That's hard to
Indigenous
stretch
gender
for 12
studies,
weeks, you'd think, but apparently not. Yeah.
it could go on for a long time, and it did. The Indigenous gender studies course was just a requirement because we needed a credit in post-colonial literature. Um, it
Which
wasn't
is in and of
something.
itself a requirement that fundamentally skews the academic environment, because
Mhm.
post-colonialism is a very fraud and politicized approach, and it's a discipline that we see. I mean, I thought it was a political science and history discipline, but now it's
Mhm.
even a literature requirement, I'm learning.
Absolutely. And since I've left, the courses have gotten much worse. Um, all the way back to when I was there, the medieval course was Old English and translation. Last year, it was queer medievalism. So um, all of the canon has now been politicized, and it's right in the course titles and right in the course descriptions, and it's all public.
When you look at the environment that you were in, how many of the students did you believe that you were in school with were true believers in this versus skeptics or people that were just sort of along for the ride. Maybe they have a higher tolerance for it, but they're not really immersed in that worldview
Mhm.
themselves?
I would say about about certainly 2/3 were highly invested.
Wow.
About 20% were just indifferent. They were there, just accepting whatever came to them. Um, and what was disappointing about that was I kind of expected a swing, but because your grades were rewarded based on your it was kind of this oppression Olympics thing going on. So whoever wrote about oppression the most, addressed the most categories of oppression, was rewarded with the highest grade. So you actually saw those students actually became more more radicalized. Like if you were to listen, I wouldn't say I don't know if they believed it, but they knew what they had to do. So they were willing to go to further extremes. And then the remaining 10%, um, a lot of whom were international students, were just a Chinese international student very early on, without my having interacted with her, just said outright, um, this is the Cultural Revolution.
Wow.
And uh, but that was just completely shot down because we're not taught about the Cultural Revolution in Canada.
I think that's an important segue to the time that you had spent abroad, and you had actually had a world of experience that you saw. You had been to China before you did your MA, and was a lot of this just so quintessentially North American in your view? Like so quintessentially North American when you were seeing just this cultural attitude? Because I've heard stories from people that have like tried to explain pronoun politics to people from India, and it's just like they're
Hmm.
speaking in completely different tongues because it just is so completely absent from the motivating forces in countries that, for whatever their issues, are doing pretty well economically, like India and China.
Hmm. Well, according to my students at RMIT, uh, RMIT is an Australian university with campuses in Vietnam. So we're getting it's a technical university. It's not too much, but we are getting a lot of these cultural sensitivity workshops that we have to present. And um, when you brought up this idea of so quintessentially North American, um, the story that came to mind right away was I presented I've had to present a workshop like that twice, and two separate students, 3 years apart, have said this is who also had studied in North America, had said this is what happens to countries that have no problems. The students, that's not to say Canada and America don't have any problems, but comparatively, um, students in Vietnam, throughout Southeast Asia, they're not particularly concerned about being identified properly according to their pronouns. So they see this as an issue that is, well, it's not an issue. It's people trying to make an issue because they have nothing else to motivate them to do anything. Conditions are um, set up for them. It's not, and what I would add to that is just what I think it is it's quintessentially North American because although my students are correct that the developed conditions are established, there's a point where it seems like development sort of uh, becomes static, and I think that's part of it as well. There's not a lot that has changed in on my return trips to Canada. It's the same place, but very, very different politics. Um, I hope that answers your question.
It does. And I guess from there, I would then go to the question of why you put up with it. Because, for if you're in a law school or a med school, there's a very clear reason that you need your degree. Whereas,
Mhm,
you could read as many books as you want and write as much as you want without
mhm,
having an MA. And I know obviously you're now teaching, so I suspect this
mhm,
may be a significant part of your answer. But if
mhm,
you had such a lofty and ambitious reason for being there, which was wanting to learn and wanting to
mhm.
grow, was there a point in which you felt that this was actually holding you back from doing that, and that you would have been able to self-teach these things outside of the classroom and say, screw the MA?
Yeah, absolutely. There was there was a time, and I've written about this in a few columns that will be coming out. There was if you're going to be a literary writer, becoming a a professor is one of the few ways that you can afford to do it. If you become a tenured professor, you're engaged in with the greatest writers of all time constantly, whilst so shaping discourse about the field whilst simultaneously contributing to it and changing to it. I had and there's plenty of figures that come to mind that heroes of mine like W.H. Auden, T.S. Eliot, David Foster Wallace, that seemed to me like the dream route where I could just be immersed in my love of literature all the time and financially secure enough to be able to pursue a career in creative writing. Um, I didn't quit the MA because I knew that it would land me a university job in Asia. And I knew about halfway I'm not sticking around for this. Um, just seeing what this does to people, and especially on campuses with young people that have grown up with social media. I think what distinguishes this culture war, and I've experienced some of this since the release of the first installment. Now all three parts are out. Um, is what distinguishes this from other culture wars of other generations is that it's mediated by this digital space where your privacy can be completely invaded.
Hmm.
The amount of passive aggressive um, Facebook posting or Twitter posting where they're not naming anybody, but there's a white supremacist in the class, and it's like, well, who is it? What and why are we creating this kind of panic? Um, it was an environment that I did not want to stick around in, and it was heartbreaking because I'd wanted to pursue the route that I described to you, ending up with tenure at a university from the time I started as an undergraduate. Really, really finding my myself and my voice through literature, pl- and getting the grades that were mid 90s, high enough that I was assured that I would have a very successful academic career, and then I came back and it was just completely different. I put up with it because I looked at university jobs in Asia. The MA was a requirement. That was motivation to finish. But if I hadn't have had that time overseas, I don't know if what would have motivated me. And I know of a lot of especially young men who have dropped out of programs, including programs like physics, because of this
Hmm.
inability to express themselves and the
Yeah.
detrimental effect it does have on their output.
Well, and then it compounds the problem, because all of a sudden the people that would counterbalance this are self-selecting out, and it eventually
Hmm.
becomes an asylum with only inmates, to
Yep.
use the expression there. Well, it is a fascinating and very evocative series. You can read it over at C2C Journal, where our friends have all 3 installments up now. Ground Zero in the Culture War, parts 1, 2, and 3. The author, Brock Eldon, joining us from Hanoi. Brock, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.